In this movie, we're going to hand brush the hooves so that they're as dark as the rest of the silhouette. So the first thing I'm going to do is press and hold the Z key so that I can get the zoom tool on the fly. And then I'll just go ahead and click a few times on the hooves like so. And then I'll release the Z key to return, in my case, to the move tool. And now I'm going to select the brush tool, which you can also get by pressing the B key. Now notice that as soon as I move my cursor into the image window, I get this universal no sign, which is telling me that I cannot brush on this layer. And that's because you can't brush directly on an adjustment layer that doesn't have any mask associated with it. So what I need to do is create a new layer that I can brush on. And you can do that, once again, in a couple of different ways. One is to click on this little page icon at the bottom of the Layers panel. And that'll create, in my case, a new layer called Layer 1, and then I'll have to double-click on that layer in order to change its name to brush strokes or what have you, and press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac to accept that change. So that's one way to work. What I'm going to do is get rid of that layer just by pressing the Backspace key or the Delete key on the Mac. So anytime you press Backspace or Delete, you're going to delete a layer inside Photoshop, which is something to watch out for, by the way. The better way to create a layer, in my opinion, is to go over here to this little flyout menu icon in the upper right corner of the Layers panel, click on it, and then choose New Layer. And notice it has a keyboard shortcut of Control-Shift-N or Command-Shift-N on the Mac, and I do recommend you assign that one to memory because we're going to be using it a lot. All right, so I'll go ahead and choose the command. That brings up the New Layer dialog box, which means that I can name the layer as I create it, and then click OK. And we have a new layer called Brushwork. And now I lose the universal no sign here inside the image window, and I see a circular brush instead. Now notice the color panel up here in the upper right corner of the screen. If you can't see it, go to the window menu and choose the color command. But because I have a check mark in front of the word color, that would hide the panel, so I don't want to do that. Notice also that you have two color swatches right here. The first one, the one that's black by default, is the foreground color, and the foreground color is the one that's employed by the brush tool, incidentally. And then the second color in the background is the background color, which by default is white. Now, also by default, the foreground color is active. You can see that it has a little double outline around it, which means that if I click inside this color field to select a shade of red, for example, or I can go ahead and change it to some other core color by dragging this triangle up and down this hue strip, then I can get a different color such as this vivid blue. And then I can paint with that color here inside the image. Now you may wonder, why am I seeing gray instead of blue? And the answer is because of this black and white adjustment layer. If I were to turn it off, then you're going to see this vivid blue brush stroke. I don't want that, however, so I'll press Control-Z or Command-Z on the Mac to undo that brush stroke, and I'll reinstate black as the foreground color by clicking on this tiny little icon down here at the bottom of the toolbox. And notice that it assigns the default foreground and background colors, and it has a keyboard shortcut of D for default. And so if I click on it, or if I press the letter D, then I'm going to reinstate black as the foreground color. And then if I paint inside the image, I will see a black brushstroke, one that doesn't change when I turn the black and white layer back on. Now, the problem with this brushstroke, besides the fact that, it's just plain ugly, is that it's soft. I don't want all of this softness here. I want a hard brush instead. So I'll just go ahead and press Control-Z or Command-Z on the Mac to once again undo that change. And I'll right-click inside the image to bring up this brush panel, and I'll crank the hardness all the way up to 100%. And let's take the size value up to something like 100 pixels as well. And then you can press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac to accept that change. And now I'll zoom out a little bit since I have such a big brush, and I'll just go ahead and drag like so. Now I want you to notice that we now have a nice sharp brush stroke, but it's very lumpy as well. So I'm going to press Control-Z or Command-Z on the Mac to undo that change, and I'll go up to the window menu, and I'll choose the brush command to bring up the brush panel, which, among other things, it's quite the panel. It has a lot of different options in it. The only one you need to pay attention to here is spacing. And notice this preview down here at the bottom of the panel. If I increase the spacing value, then I'm going to pull apart these dollops of paint. So what Photoshop is doing is laying down a bunch of circles in rapid succession in order to create a continuous brushstroke. If you space them apart, of course, you're going to lose that continuity. And if you space them closer together, things are going to get lumpy. And then if you keep reducing that spacing value to, say, 10%, you're going to get a nice smooth brushstroke like so, which is exactly what we want, at which point you can hide the brush panel by clicking on this little double arrow icon, and you're ready to go. And so now if I paint a big brushstroke, it's not only sharp, but it's also extremely smooth. And notice, by the way, because we added a new layer, I can go ahead and turn that brushstroke off, or I can turn it back on. I can also switch back to the Move tool up here at the top of the toolbox, and I can drag this brushstroke to any location that I like, meaning that I have an independent layer of brushwork, and I haven't harmed the original image at all. And that's how you create a new layer as well as paint on it with a nice sharp black brush here inside Photoshop.